12 hours earlier, Ethan had been sitting in the Hayes kitchen, drinking cocoa and laughing lightly as Laura moved around the stove preparing dinner. Ethan had always admired her, not in a shallow way, but with a quiet reverence, for her warmth, grace, and the way she carried responsibility after losing her husband years earlier. Ryan had gone out with friends and wasn't expected back until late, leaving Ethan and Laura alone. Their dynamic had always been naturally friendly, but that evening, something felt different, quieter, more personal. Laura seemed tired, shoulders tense, eyes slightly distant, losing warmth in her smile as though something weighed on her mind. When she casually mentioned needing to drive into town at night to deliver documents to a client, Ethan immediately offered to accompany her, eager to help, or maybe simply eager to be in. The road started clear and silent as they drove under a pale winter moon. Laura kept both hands on the steering wheel, eyes alert but distant. Ethan occasionally glanced at her, the way the soft dashboard light traced along her cheekbones, the faint tremble in her breath, and the way her lips pressed together in thought. He sensed something was wrong, something unspoken. He asked once if she was okay, and she brushed it off with a brittle laugh. The snow began lightly at first, flakes dancing, then thickened into a curtain. Laura turned on the heater, but the cold air kept seeping through every seam of the vehicle. As visibility dropped, her tension became palpable. Ethan offered to drive, and after a moment's internal struggle, she agreed. They switched seats by the roadside, the air slicing into them like knives. Then Ethan continued forward, trying to exude confidence he wasn't fully feeling. Ear her. She hesitated, then agreed. Only a few miles later, the truck began rumbling strangely, every vibration scraping at their nerves. The snowstorm now roared like a furious living thing, reducing the world to a blur of white. Ethan pressed the gas, but the tires only spun uselessly against accumulating snow. Then came the fading of the lights, the silent death of the engine, and finally, the slow descent of the cabin into frigid darkness. Laura's breathing hitched, not quite panic, but close. They checked their phones. Nothing. No bars. No GPS. No communication. Just them and the storm. Laura wrapped her coat tighter, but her hands were shaking. Ethan tried restarting the engine again and again. Nothing but clicks. The temperature was dropping fast, invading through the metal like creeping ice. Laura finally whispered, voice barely audible over the storm's howl, "We might be here for a while." Ethan grew up watching his single mother fight relentlessly to keep them afloat, juggling 2 jobs, collapsing into sleep on the couch, still wearing her work uniform, and never complaining aloud. Despite loving her deeply, Ethan constantly felt like a supporting character in his own life. He was quiet, intelligent, good-hearted, but always overshadowed by louder personalities, more confident kids, and people who didn't hesitate the way he always did. Working part-time at a local hardware store, Ethan endured customers who spoke over him or ignored him entirely, reinforcing that lingering sense of invisibility. He was used to being the listener, the helper, the dependable extra, never the one who took center stage. And yet, he carried a sensitive soul, intense empathy, and emotional depth that no one ever seemed to notice. That was why he admired Laura. She saw him. Or at least, he hoped she did. Laura was a woman who had weathered storms, heartbreak, divorce, emotional distance from her son, and a creeping fear that life was moving forward without her. After her marriage dissolved, custody battles and financial strain left scars that never fully healed. Ryan's teenage years had been rebellious, self-absorbed, and dismissive, leaving Laura feeling more like a maid and less like a mother. He took her care for granted, leaving messes, demanding favors, expecting resources, but rarely offering genuine appreciation. She worked part-time remotely, supplemented with freelance bookkeeping, balancing responsibilities with little recognition. And while outwardly composed and polite, inside she carried loneliness, an aching desire to feel valued, chosen, seen. Ethan, unlike Ryan, listened when she spoke. He respected her, not because she was an authority figure, but because he genuinely admired her. Still, she carefully hid any affection that might be misread, even by herself. The cabin weekend had originally been Ryan's idea, a getaway with Ethan, gaming, movies, and snow, an escape from school pressures. But Ryan's volatile romance with his girlfriend exploded the night before, ending with slammed doors, shouted accusations, and Ryan storming off. He texted Ethan a short message, "Not going. Handle it." Laura, already committed to checking the cabin utilities and winterizing pipes, didn't want to postpone. She told Ethan she could drive him home afterward instead of leaving him stranded. Ethan agreed, unaware that this small decision would ripple into something much larger. On the way, worsening weather forced them into a detour, then into a remote stretch of highway, until, just like that, the truck died. And now, Laura and Ethan sit side by side, breath steaming in the freezing air, pressed closer by necessity, by danger, and by a silence brimming with unspoken layers. The temperature inside the truck plummeted rapidly, every minute stealing more warmth from their bodies. Laura's shivering soon became uncontrollable, her teeth chattering, hands trembling, skin losing color. She tried to put on a brave face, insisting she was fine, but Ethan could hear the tightness in her voice, see the unfocused glaze in her eyes. Without hesitation, and without waiting for her permission, Ethan removed his jacket and draped it around her shoulders. She resisted, weakly pushing it back, partly out of pride, partly fear of impropriety, but then her body contradicted her words, instinctively clutching the warmth to her chest. Ethan's proximity, his gentle insistence, and the desperate urgency of survival stripped away social boundaries. For the first time, she looked at him not as her son's friend, but as someone deeply concerned for her well-being, someone who actually cared. And she let him. Wrapped in Ethan's jacket, Laura's defenses began to melt. She stared at the dark windshield and confessed in a trembling voice, "I'm failing as a mother. I don't even know if Ryan loves me anymore." Ethan didn't answer immediately. Her confession struck something raw inside him. When he finally spoke, he admitted that Ryan often belittled him, treating him like a sidekick, someone convenient to have around but never truly valued. They weren't just sharing facts, they were exposing wounds, deep, hidden, tender. With the storm raging outside, the truck became a confessional chamber, and the vulnerability in Laura's voice broke something open inside Ethan. He had never seen her like this, fragile, uncertain, real. And she had never seen him like this, quietly hurting, silently, enduring years of dismissal. In that moment, they stopped being older woman and young man, and became simply two hurting people. Laura hesitated before speaking the words that couldn't be unsaid. Her voice was soft, but it struck with force. "Ryan talks about you, and not kindly. He mocks you behind your back."
The words landed like a physical blow.
Ethan felt something collapse inside him, a friendship, a trust, a history. Ryan had been his closest friend, or so he believed. Now every memory suddenly felt tainted, every laugh, every shared moment shadowed by ridicule he had never heard. Laura watched the shock travel across Ethan's face, and she regretted causing pain, but not speaking the truth. In the suffocating stillness that followed, loyalties began to fracture. Ethan wasn't just freezing, he was awakening. And Laura wasn't just shivering, she was unburdening. The storm outside was merciless, but the storm inside Ethan had just begun. Minutes became hours, and the battery gave its final flicker, leaving them in almost complete darkness except for faint moonlit shadows through the frozen windshield. The cold was no longer discomfort, it was a slow, creeping threat. Their breath fogged between them, visible like soft smoke, rising, merging, vanishing. Laura's hands had gone numb, and Ethan gently took them in his, rubbing warmth into her skin, not out of impulse, but necessity. Ethan wasn't even thinking anymore. He was acting.
Survival instincts overrode hesitation.
Without the heater, they positioned themselves closer, shoulder pressed to shoulder, thighs absorbing what little warmth the other had. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't daring. It was a silent pact. We will get through this. In the darkness, their awareness sharpened. Proximity stripped away roles, ages, social labels, leaving only humanity. Ethan finally spoke, voice trembling from both cold and vulnerability. "I always wondered why Ryan kept me around. I guess I wanted to matter to someone." The words spilled out, years of repressed insecurity, invisible pain. He told Laura how he was always the helper, never the hero, always reliable, never remarkable. Laura listened, her eyes glistening with something more than cold. Then she confessed something heavier, that she emotionally chose her ex-husband again and again over Ryan, not physically, but emotionally, giving her attention, affection, and energy to a man who never reciprocated. Ryan grew up feeling secondary, and pushed her away. As she spoke, her voice quivered with regret. Ethan squeezed her hand, not to comfort her as a boy to an adult, but as one human holding another human's broken truth. They didn't speak for a while after that, conversation replaced by shared silence. Not an awkward silence, but a profound one. Ethan rested his head lightly against hers, and she didn't pull away. The warmth of human presence, even minimal, became a lifeline against the cold gnawing in through steel and glass. They were no longer defined by age, roles, or history. They were simply two souls caught in a hostile storm, binding together in honesty and survival. Laura whispered, "You deserved better than how he treated you." Ethan replied, "And you deserved better than being taken for granted." The words weren't sentimental, they were true. In that dark frozen cabin, they were finally seen. Not as placeholders in someone else's story, but as people worthy of love, respect, and significance. The cold had carved its way into their bones, and yet in that numb stillness, Laura spoke with sudden clarity. "Ryan isn't really angry at the world. He's angry at his father. And he takes it out on you because you're safe." The words stunned Ethan, not because they were cruel, but because they were illuminating. Laura went on, voice soft but unwavering. "Ryan grew up under a father who tore him down, ridiculed him, withheld love as a weapon." Ethan suddenly saw it. Ryan didn't target him because Ethan was weak, but because Ethan was kind.
Ethan wouldn't eat back.
Ethan wouldn't abandon him. Ethan became the emotional punching bag, because Ryan could trust him not to break. Ethan's breath caught in the air, not from cold, but from revelation. He had always thought loyalty made him lesser, but maybe loyalty had made him stronger. Ethan wasn't just hearing Laura's words, he was rewriting his entire self-story. Memories flashed through him like lightning, Ryan's jabs, Ryan's mockery, Ryan's dominance, and suddenly they looked different. He remembered countless times when Ryan had lashed out, and Ethan always absorbed it. Not because he lacked strength, but because he exercised restraint. He began to see himself not as the side character, not as the inferior friend, but as the anchor, the safe harbor that Ryan subconsciously clung to. And a thought, terrifying and liberating, entered his mind: I deserved better. He met Laura's eyes, and for the first time, he wasn't looking for validation. He was looking from a place of equal worth. Outside, the storm continued raging, but inside Ethan, something thawed. Confidence. Self-worth. A reclaiming of dignity he never hours passed, and they grew quieter, not emotionally withdrawn, but internally strengthened.
Then, out of nowhere, a flash of white light cut through the blizzard.
Headlights.
Moving closer. Swelling brighter.
A plow truck and then a rescue vehicle came into view, slowing beside them. Relief and disbelief surged through Ethan and Laura as figures approached the frozen truck. They were saved, physically. But the emotional journey was still in motion. As rescuers opened the door, frigid air mixed with the warm arrival of hope. Ethan instinctively held onto Laura's hand, not out of dependence now, but solidarity. They stepped out into the storm, no longer alone, no longer unseen. They would return to normal life, but nothing would be normal anymore. Ethan would face Ryan with new eyes, and Laura would face motherhood with new honesty. The snowstorm might end, but the emotional reckoning was just beginning. New was his. Recovery came slowly: warm rooms, blankets, hot fluids, and days of reflection. When Ethan finally saw Ryan again, there was no rage, no icy silence, just clarity. They met in Ryan's room, surrounded by the artifacts of their shared adolescence: game controllers, posters, old photos. Ethan spoke with steady calm. "I know what you've been saying about me. I deserve better, as a friend and as a person." Ryan scoffed at first, a defensive reflex, tried to deflect with humor. But Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't crumble. His eyes held steady, calm, unwavering. The power dynamic shifted instantly.
Ryan's voice faltered.
For the first time, he was the one without footing. The silence that followed didn't belong to Ethan, it belonged to Ryan, who finally had to confront the truth that he had been using Ethan as emotional scaffolding for years. Meanwhile, Laura sat across from Ryan in the kitchen, hands folded, eyes soft but determined. She didn't defend herself, didn't justify, she simply spoke honestly. She apologized for years of emotional absence, for prioritizing a failed marriage over motherhood, for leaving him to navigate wounds alone. Ryan didn't know how to absorb this, a mother acknowledging fault, not as an accusation but as an offering of healing. She then did something new. She asserted boundaries. She told him she would no longer accept disrespect or emotional manipulation. And she invited him to share his pain, not as an excuse, but as a step toward connection. Ryan's bitterness cracked, and beneath it was hurt, confusion, and loneliness. They began rebuilding, not through forced affection, but through honest conversation and earned trust. Laura reclaimed her voice, and in doing so, reclaimed her role as a true parent. And the weeks that followed, Ethan changed, not outwardly at first, but internally. He stopped apologizing for existing. He stopped playing the supporting role in every interaction. At work, he spoke with assurance and presence. In conversations, he held eye contact instead of averting it. He no longer allowed himself to be compressed into the role of quiet helper. He started setting boundaries, kindly but firmly. And as Ethan walked through life with new posture, he also saw Laura differently, not as someone unreachable or superior, but as an equal soul who had battled her own shadows. Their connection remained respectful, rooted in shared humanity rather than dependency. Ethan finally understood. His worth had never been determined by Ryan, or by anyone who struggled to value him. He wasn't the sidekick. He was the author of his own story now. A week later, the snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of earth and softened winter ground. Ethan stepped outside to bring in a delivery when he saw Laura waiting on the sidewalk, bundled in a warm coat, but with a face far lighter than before. Their eyes met, and neither rushed to speak. Laura finally said, with a sincerity that rang clear, "That night changed me. I'm learning to be honest with myself. And with the people I love." Those words weren't dramatic. They were real, earned. Ethan didn't fidget, didn't shrink, didn't avert his gaze. Instead, he answered steadily, "Same. I'm done being someone's shadow." Neither tried to prolong the moment or make it bigger than it was. It was quiet, mature. A closing loop between two people forever altered by one night, without breaking the natural boundaries of their worlds. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was full. Full of mutual recognition, warmth, and gratitude. Laura's smile was small but real, the kind that came from relief rather than pretense. Ethan nodded once, gently, a gesture of respect, not submission, not yearning. There was no touch, no lingering glances, no boundary-crossing energy. Just two human beings who understood the truth of what they had experienced. Not a forbidden closeness, but a shared survival. Laura said softly, "Thank you for being there. For seeing me." Ethan replied simply, "You saw me too." And that was enough. Laura turned and headed to her car, hands tucked into her coat pockets. Ethan watched briefly, then turned back toward his front door, the world feeling a bit clearer, warmer, and more fitting than it had before. Ethan stepped into the house, closing the door behind him. His mother looked up from the kitchen, surprised to see him home earlier than usual. And without a word of explanation, Ethan walked straight to her and wrapped his arms around her, tight, full, sincere. At first she stiffened in shock, then melted into the embrace, feeling her son truly hold on to her for the first time in years. Ethan didn't cry, but there was a tremor of something deep in the way he clung to his mother. He wasn't the quiet shadow anymore. He wasn't the emotional dumping ground. He wasn't the invisible sidekick. He was someone who survived, grew, awakened, and was finally allowing himself to love and be loved fully. The embrace wasn't dramatic. It was cleansing.
A new beginning, made of warmth, truth, and home.